Arguments for the Godless. My name is Justin Schieber, and for those of you who don't know me, I have been the co-host of the Reasonable Doubts podcast for the last 4 years or so. And on that show, I largely focused on arguments in philosophy of religion. It's a real interest of mine, ever since I left the religious tradition in which I was raised. And so with my focus in philosophy of religion, I've done about 10 to 15 debates around the United States and Canada with different apologists, theologians, and philosophers. And it's just something I really enjoy. And so I'm excited to talk to you guys about this. So what is philosophy of religion? Well, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, philosophy of religion is the philosophical examination of the central themes and concepts within religious traditions. So don't worry about raising your hand, but shout out some questions that philosophers working within philosophy of religion might be interested in. So, problem of evil, and its relevance to the evidential weights of the existence of God.
Source of morality.
The source of morality is, does morality make sense only with theistic assumptions, or, as some have proposed, does it only make sense in theism's absence? Other questions might be things like, sorry? Absolutely. Other questions are things like, what, if any, are the necessary evidential requirements to have rational theistic belief? Some philosophers have argued that theistic belief is not like other beliefs. It has a special kind of place in our epistemic structure to where it's kind of like believing in the physical world, that the physical world exists. We can't give evidential arguments for that. And so they're saying that God is like that God is like belief in other minds or in the physical world, that it's not the kind of thing you can construct arguments for, but nevertheless we're perfectly rational in believing it. That's a position.
An afterlife.
I'm sorry?
Is there absence of an afterlife?
Yes. Yeah, there are a lot of different questions here. And so for various reasons both of historical contingency and reasons more philosophical in nature, the view of God that gets the most attention within philosophy of religion circles is the Western view of God, this kind of monotheistic God where, and we've all heard it, God is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly morally good. And insofar as there exists anything that is not God, God is in some sense responsible for its existence, either directly or indirectly. And I don't think it would be controversial to say that to at least philosophers working within philosophy of religion, that is the most plausible version of God. Even if you're an atheist, you think that that's probably, if there is a God of any sort, that's probably the one with the best hopes to succeed. Now, the question of the existence of God is actually a pretty complex question. I think that a lot of people don't recognize how complex it is. It touches on nearly every aspect of human inquiry, and I'm convinced it's also a deeply important question. And while I agree that the standard monotheism is false, I do think that it is one of the most promising forms of theism. But I think that it fails because I think that there is an atheistic hypothesis that is more successful in important ways than the best theistic hypothesis. And so that's what I'm going to be exploring today. And what's important to notice is that different people are going to be starting in different places, right? So you might have, and I recognize that the definitions here, not everyone's going to agree with, but these are generally how the words are used in the academic literature in philosophy of religion. You have the atheist who thinks that God doesn't exist or probably doesn't exist. You have the agnostic who thinks that all the relevant concerns are kind of ambiguous, so they don't really know. They don't really, not just that they don't know, but they don't actually hold a belief in one direction or the other. They just think it's kind of difficult for them to tell. Then you have the theists, varying degrees of confidence in their theistic belief. And now, so let's say I do a particularly bang-up job of presenting these evidential arguments. And as a result, all three of these hypothetical persons, as to their views of the probability of God, they start to begin to shift. What might that look like? Well, it might look like something like that. But notice that because they're all starting off with different priors, they still can rationally disagree even after hearing the arguments and absorbing them in the days or weeks to come. So, again, you can have people starting at different positions, and of course their starting place may or may not be the result of a thorough and deep investigation into the question at hand. That's not particularly relevant, because what matters is that a lot of the times these are kind of like pre-inferential beliefs, in that they're coming to the theist believes what he believes largely because of his culture, perhaps, because of the intuitions, the metaphysical intuitions that he's been raised with, the kind of stories he's told. Because of his upbringing, he might find certain ideas more plausible than others, while someone raised in a thoroughly atheistic household is going to have vastly different intuitions, right? So that's how we can, that's why people, obviously why people disagree on a lot of things. And so when you add new evidence, everyone, at least if they're doing it right, they should adjust to some degree. It might be that the theist just becomes less confident. Maybe he's still a theist, though. So, what should that tell us? I think that at the very least, it should tell us that we should be very, very suspicious of people on either side of this debate saying really broad claims like, all theists are irrational, all atheists are irrational, right? You hear these claims, and these are wildly oversimplistic claims. They don't take into consideration something that should be obvious to everybody, which is that people come to the table with different priors, and all we can hope people to do is, when they approach new evidence, to adjust. And it might be that they, for reasons that they lack the evidential, or they lack access to certain information, it might be that they never adjust to what we all think is the correct position. But nevertheless, if they're adjusting, they're still being rational in that adjustment, and that's what we want out of people. We don't want them to get to our conclusions necessarily, right? We want them to be thinking carefully and adjusting as they go along and learn new information. Now, I've already said that I think theism is false because I believe that the best atheistic hypothesis is, on balance, better in two important ways than the best theistic hypothesis. So if we are to kind of embark on this comparative endeavor, then I should probably say at least a few things about what the kind of atheistic hypothesis that I would be interested in defending. So the atheistic hypothesis that I'm interested in defending here is called naturalism. Without getting too detailed, naturalism, at least as I view it, asserts that the natural world is a causally closed system. This entails that there are no entities which exist outside of the natural world, and that they're also capable of interacting within the natural world. So there are no entities like that. Now, of course, if naturalism is true, then theism, as we've defined it, is false. Now, I've noted that the first important way in which I'll be arguing that naturalism is a better hypothesis than theism is that it is a simpler hypothesis than theism. And the second most important way I think that we need to be judging, comparing hypotheses, is that it is a better fit with the evidence. It's a more accurate hypothesis. But can anybody else think of any other kind of relevant concerns we might want to weigh on these questions here? Falsifiability. Yeah, so Karl Popper forwarded the idea of falsifiability, which says that, look, something isn't scientific unless you can name a state of affairs such that if you were to observe it, that your theory would be then disproven. Now, that's actually kind of a controversial thing. It's no longer held as the kind of standard view of what we would want to call science here. But that's certainly something that has been an issue in hypothesis comparison. Another one might be the degree to which it leads to wildly successful research programs that diverge in their own way and kind of bring about a rich path toward new understanding. Now, so the question here is, okay, well, at least on my first issue, simplicity, putting evidence aside, just looking at simplicity, how does naturalism and theism fare on this issue, on simplicity? Well, I actually agree with philosopher Paul Draper when he argues that naturalism and supernaturalism are, prior to the evidence, roughly equivalent hypotheses in their simplicity. So we're just looking at the bare conceptual content of those hypotheses. We're not looking at how well they fit the data, right? We're just looking at that which theism asserts, just basic theism, and then that which basic naturalism asserts. So Paul Draper's arguing that, look, naturalism and supernaturalism, they're both broad, very broad in scope, and for a couple other reasons, that they're both pretty much on par when it comes to simplicity issues, okay? Okay, well, that's great. But of course, we're not comparing naturalism and supernaturalism. Rather, we are comparing naturalism in a very specific form of supernaturalism, mainly the form that rather ambitiously takes on board a plethora of additional assertions about an all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect God. Of course, you can have supernaturalism be true and theism not be true. Theism is a particular form of supernaturalism. It's a specific form. It's naturalism plus. And of course, you can even go further, right? So you say, okay, well, what if we want to talk about a specific kind of sectarian version of theistic supernaturalism? Well, you can have Christian theistic supernaturalism. At this point, it's quite clear that the theistic hypothesis on offer is quite wildly and ambitiously more complex than the naturalism, right? So that's not a good thing. We generally want the more simpler hypothesis. So that's the thing that should raise red flags, even prior to the evidence. So again, prior to the evidence, naturalism already has an advantage that theism does not. And that's huge. And that's something I think that people don't take notice of as much as they should. Because even before getting the evidence, naturalism is already starting off with a head start when it comes to the conceptual comparison of the two hypotheses. So again, naturalism is a simpler hypothesis, and philosophers generally agree that all else being equal, we should prefer the simpler hypothesis over the more complex one. Now remember that the other important way by which I would like to compare naturalism and theism is its accuracy, its ability to explain the observations in the world. Now, of course, I can't go through today and look at every single observation and ask whether or not this is evidence for theism or naturalism, but what I can do is arm you guys with probably some ideas that you're familiar with, but kind of show how the inference might actually work in a kind of more philosophical way here. So again, I bring us back to the question, what is evidence? What do we mean when we say something is evidence for something else? What do we mean by that? We can usually give examples, right? We can say the order of fossils from relatively simple organisms to more complex organisms as we climb in the fossil record would be clearly evidence for evolution. But why is that? What is the relationship between the observation and the theory at hand that makes that evidence? Well, philosopher of science at Johns Hopkins University, Victor DeFate, writes that the most widely accepted probabilistic account of evidence is the so-called increase in probability or positive relevance account. So the idea here is simply that E is evidence for H, some hypothesis, if and only if E makes H more probable than it would have been alone. So, a hypothesis, you have it there, if the addition of new information increases the probability of that hypothesis being true, then that's what we mean by evidence. That's all we mean. So you can have, contrary to what I unfortunately hear often, where people say there is no evidence for God. Those people are usually working with a wildly misunderstood understanding of what evidence actually means, or they're just misunderstanding, they're unaware of some obvious evidence. So, for example, I would argue that the basic idea of life existing is more probable on theism than on atheism. So it's some evidence for theism. It's not a particularly impressive argument, but it's some evidence, and that needs to at least be recognized. So from that we can from this very basic idea, we can kind of think about, okay, well, what would count as good evidence for naturalism and against theism? Well, what we can draw from this is that particularly good evidence for naturalism and against theism will be observations that are very much to be expected on the assumption that naturalism is true, but rather surprising on the assumption that theism is true. And so I want to bring to our attention 3 observations. Again, some of these you might be vaguely familiar with that fit this description and so constitute evidence for naturalism and against theism. And there are, of course, other observations, but I'm going to stick to these 3 for obvious time limitations. And to be clear, none of these observations, even jointly considered, are going to prove that God doesn't exist. This is an evidential case. This is inductive logic. You can't. So now, most of the time, when people get into these kinds of arguments are often discussed in the context of a debate or a conversation. However, that's actually a really important point in and of itself, right? Because such a conversation on both sides presupposes that it's at least possible for intelligent and fair-minded individuals to disagree about the existence of God. That's possible. Again, people are coming from wildly different things, right? Different situations, different perspectives, different access to different information. And so that brings us to the question of the hiddenness of God. See, it's quite clear that there are many people who do not believe in God. That's kind of a trivial thing to say at this point in time. Some, like myself, actually wish that at least some basic form of theism were true. I think the world would be a wildly different place, but I think it would be a generally better state of affairs. But I just simply can't bring myself to believe it, right? I think that the evidence, I think that other more a priori concerns, like simplicity, weigh against it so much that it's not really a plausible hypothesis for me to entertain. So, as we've already discussed, equally clear, as the fact that there are non-believers, equally clear is the fact that a lot of these non-believers are not resisting theism. Some might actually wish that it were true. And some, of course, might find that the evidence is ambiguous, right? So they're not anti-theists. They don't wish that theism weren't true. They're indifferent to it. They don't know. They might have a positive view toward it, but they just have no idea whether it's true or not. So all that is to say that if God exists, he's not made his existence sufficiently clear to satisfy even those who very much wish he was real. And it is this fact about non-resistant non-believers, which will serve as my first point of evidence, represented by H here, for hiddenness. And that was supposed to change. Here we go. So when we get to the actual argument, what would an argument like this look like? Well, this is kind of a basic likelihood form argument, where we're comparing the likelihood of the observation on one hypothesis, and then you're comparing that same observation, how likely it is to arise on its competing hypothesis. And we're comparing theism and naturalism as to their ability to yield the observation of non-resistant non-believers. And it turns out that H is extremely unlikely on the assumption that theism is true. On theism, we're expected to believe that there exists a morally perfect God who wants relationships with the persons that he's created. God would want a meaningful relationship, a meaningful conscious relationship with the creatures whom he loved. And so for this reason, God would ensure that all such creatures, so long as they were not resistant to him, at least believed that he existed, because only then would those persons be in a position to enter into any kind of meaningful relationship with God. So on theism, the fact that there are indeed non-resistant unbelievers is a wildly surprising observation to come across. Interestingly, what's interesting about this argument is that these persons themselves are evidence for their own conclusions. That's what's so interesting about the hiddenness argument. Premise 2, H is highly likely if naturalism is true. If naturalism is true, this is not at all surprising, of course, right? Indeed, the poverty of theistic arguments is entirely expected on naturalism because there is no God. And so if God does not exist, there is, of course, nobody there to prevent non-resistant unbelief in the various forms which it might take. And so therefore, H is strong evidence for naturalism and against theism. Interestingly, what's interesting about this argument is that these persons themselves are evidence for their own conclusions. That's what's so interesting about the hiddenness argument. So, have you guys come across? I mean, have you guys used a kind of argument like this? What kind of responses do you get for something like this? The kind of where we say that there are non-resistant unbelievers. Anybody get? Yeah.
They're deceived by Satan.
Okay. Yeah. So they're under misapprehension. Yeah.
You're denying the truth in your own unrighteousness.
There you go. One back here.
I don't find that God's hidden at all. He's in my life daily.
Right. Here.
Evidence of absence, or absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
That would be false. But you're right. People claim that. In certain situations, absence of evidence can be evidence of absence, mainly if that particular kind of evidence is expected on the hypothesis. I think you raised it over here. One of the most common objections I get to this argument is that the Christian will come and say, "But Justin, look, there are no non-resistant unbelievers. They all resist God in their unrighteousness, and these people are usually quick with a biblical verse to back up their point, as if that's going to impress anybody." However, this is an arrogance of just biblical proportions, and it fails to be anything other than assuming to be true the very thing being challenged in the argument, and so constitutes a textbook case of question begging. The point is this: there simply is no good reason to think, without assuming Christian theism to be true, that all persons who don't believe in God are somehow resistant. Right? That's just so wildly implausible. There's really no way they could make that claim. Another quite common objection to this line of thought here is that it's kind of a demand that God spell his name in the stars, right? These are unfair demands that you're placing upon God, right? But of course, this objection fails to interact with us in a serious way with the argument. As philosopher John Schellenberg writes, quote, "It doesn't take much imagination to see how non-resistant non-belief in its various forms could be prevented through the provision of more subtle and interesting forms of evidence, such as religious experience, whose character are modulated according to our intellectual needs." Right? So it doesn't need to be a public event, right? God could just get into all of our heads and make us believe, right? So that's just it's really just a straw man response to the argument. The next argument I want to discuss is the hostility to life of the universe. So consider the father who builds his child a home in which to live. It's a big, beautiful construction, rich in detail and in character. And upon entering the house, the open floor plan yields a breathtaking view of a sizable portion of the entire house, right from the entryway. Now, on the hypothesis that a loving father built this home for this child, we'd rightly be surprised if stepping anywhere beyond that initial entryway triggered, a dense network of booby traps of the sort found in the movie Home Alone, for example. The construction of the house in the story and the universe in which we live carry an important resemblance. Like the house in our story, the vast majority of the universe is hostile to most forms of biological life that we know of. In his book, Death from the Skies, astronomer Phil Plait writes, quote, "The universe is an incredibly hostile place for life. Virtually all of it is a vacuum, so that's bad right from the start. Of the extremely few places that aren't hard vacuum, most are too hot for chemical reactions to do very well. Molecules get blasted apart before they can even properly form. Of the places that aren't too hot, most are too cold. Reactions happen too slowly to get anything interesting to occur in the first place. He continues elsewhere, in reality, the universe does not care at all if we live or die. If a human were to magically be transported to any random spot in the cosmos, within seconds he'd die. 99.999999999% of the time. So as you can see, it's quite difficult to come away with anything other than the universe is a death trap. Premise 1. This hostility is highly unlikely in the assumption that theism is true, right? If theism is true and God has created the universe for us, it's a strange and awkward fact then why the universe should appear to be almost entirely designed to kill the very beings for which it was created to sustain. Let me be clear, of course God could have created things like this, right? You could always maybe invent some reason. But of course, he could have created it in a million other ways which would not have automatically killed us merely for venturing from our pale blue dot. Premise 2, H is not unlikely on the assumption that naturalism is true, right? If naturalism is true, this isn't at all surprising, because life isn't special in the universe. So we shouldn't expect the universe to care about us any more than it should care about a particular comet remaining on course. And so my third argument here, well, the conclusion, of course, is that given premise 1 and 2, the hostility of the universe strongly supports naturalism over theism. Now we get to the idea of pointless suffering. Now most of you, I think, are going to be familiar with the logical problem of evil, which attempts to demonstrate a logical contradiction between the existence of God and any evil or suffering in the world at all. But I'm perfectly willing, actually, to grant that God, if he were to exist, might have morally sufficient reasons to allow some examples of suffering or evil in the world. After all, it seems plausible that if God exists, he might have reasons to allow suffering, perhaps to ensure some greater good, or to avoid some equally bad or worse instance of suffering, right? Those seem like plausible assumptions. Again, contingent upon the idea that God exists in the first place. However, if God existed, he would not allow an instance of suffering unless it was logically necessary for that greater good or for the avoidance of some equally bad or worse instance of suffering. But of course, now we get to the problem, because many instances of suffering seem that we see in our world, both by human and non-human animals, seem suspiciously like the exact kinds of suffering that a perfectly loving being would prevent if he did exist. They seem utterly pointless. So if you think of the instances of suffering caused by other human agents, and this is generally called moral suffering here, think of slavery of the American South, think of the Holocaust, think of ISIS, right? These are all moral problems. The usual response here is to argue that God gave us free will. And our abuse of free will is just that, right? It's an abuse. Now, I agree that, generally we should appreciate people's ability to make mistakes and to learn and grow from those mistakes. However, this kind of free will we must recognize is not a trump card, right? We already all know this. Imagine you're walking down the street and you witness an elderly couple getting beaten within an inch of their lives simply so that their attacker can score a gold watch. Are we not morally obligated to intervene? Of course we are. If we are able, of course we are. Now, if respecting the attacker's free will is not an adequate justification for our playing hands-off, then why on earth should we think that this is an adequate justification for God's playing his hands-off? Then, of course, you have natural suffering. Think of the central theory of biology, right? The theory of evolution by natural selection. It can only occur with massive amounts of suffering and death, most of which have occurred long before humans even entered the world stage. And notice that this is not just an accidental byproduct. That's a huge important point here. It's not just an accidental byproduct. Rather, the suffering here is intrinsic to the system. Also in this category are things like earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, disease, famine. This is all very real and deeply felt suffering. We must admit that this massive amount of seemingly pointless suffering constitutes, or is very surprising on the assumption that theism is true. But of course, premise 2 on naturalism, it's not at all surprising, because again, the naturalist has no problem fitting these facts into his view. On naturalism, the universe is indifferent to our suffering. It is blind to our well-being. The massive amount of seemingly pointless suffering, therefore, strongly supports naturalism over theism. Now, you may be thinking, we've all heard this response, but God is mysterious, right? He may have reasons beyond your understanding for allowing these tragedies. And that, of course, may be true, but this does little to undermine the comparative evidential argument that we're talking about today. And this is huge. When we put the argument in this form, where we're comparing two different hypotheses as to their ability to yield the data, it doesn't do anything. Because, of course, it might be that God has extra reasons that of course it might be the case that God might have reasons, if he were to exist, to allow certain instances of suffering, reasons that are unknown to us. So we're appealing to a set of unknowns. That's what the theist is doing. But, of course, there's no reason why the theist shouldn't also say, but there's a whole category of unknowns over here, mainly extra reasons to prevent the sufferings that he... So at the end of the day, when we're looking at it comparatively in this way, those two categories of unknowns cancel out, and you're left with the fact that naturalism makes more sense of these observations than theism could ever hope to. And that's a huge point. If you come away with anything, comparative evidential arguments are where it's at. Okay, let's get to the summary here. Again, I've given several reasons, both evidential and pre-evidential, that naturalism is a simpler hypothesis than theism. And that's a huge, important point that is often overlooked, and that naturalism is a more accurate hypothesis than theism. And I give 3 reasons for thinking this, and these, of course, are not at all exhaustive of the possible reasons one might appeal to. Non-resistant unbelievers, the hostile universe, and the seemingly pointless instances of suffering, the massive amount of them. And thank you very much. And questions?
If you liked this video, please subscribe to Real Atheology. And better yet, share it with your friends. Be sure to like the growing Real Atheology Facebook page, and also please consider becoming a patron of Real Atheology by contributing even just $1 or $2 per video to help me bring quality atheological content your way. Thank you for watching.